Very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, for choosing to be with us this evening. My name is Anne Culligan, and I am a mental health and wellness coach based out of St. Michael's Catholic Secondary with the Huron Perth Catholic District School Board. So this event was made possible through a collaboration between the Huron Perth Catholic District School Board, the Avon Maitland District School Board, and Victim Services, and we are so excited to provide you with all this information in our webinar regarding human trafficking. So this webinar was originally planned for February 22nd, as that day is recognized to encourage Canadians to raise awareness of the magnitude of modern-day slavery in Canada and abroad, and to take steps to combat human trafficking. Due to weather and connectivity challenges, the webinar was rescheduled for this evening. We are so fortunate to have the opportunity to gather online to offer this information to all of you, the critical adults in the lives of our children and youth in Huron and Perth counties. Now, I'm delighted to be introducing our presenter for this evening. Dawson Curry is the lead crisis responder with Victim Services of Huron County. Victim Services Huron is a community-based organization geared toward the support of victims and survivors in the immediate aftermath of crime and tragedy. Prior to joining Victim Services, Dawson completed his undergraduate education at Wilfrid Laurier University in the field of political science and criminology. From there, Dawson went on to work in various settings, including corrections, mental health, addictions work, and now in a crisis support role to first responders. Dawson has presented on behalf of Victim Services to thousands of people on various topics and currently provides training to a variety of first responders, educators, and more. In addition to this, Dawson continues to play an active role in the support of human trafficking survivors in a frontline capacity, working in conjunction with municipal, regional, and provincial law enforcement, and actively consults on policies directly related to human trafficking in both education and public spaces. Dawson is currently a certified threat assessment professional and brings experience directly related to crisis management, mental health, and trauma-informed care, combined with a desire to see our communities thrive. It is now my great pleasure to turn it over to Dawson Curry.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Again, for you folks on the call tonight, I really appreciate you making some space with your schedules tonight. I totally appreciate that there's a number of different things.
Why is the speaker not working?
Oh, I apologize. I will go over a couple of housekeeping things along the way just to make sure that things make sense as much as possible. My goal for tonight is to have as informative and valuable time together as we possibly can. What I'm hoping to do is work through some of the information that we present regularly to students, to young adults, to people in our community, so that you folks are just as informed as to what's going on, as to where things are at with the current state of human trafficking knowledge in our area. From there, I do like to try and keep things as engaging as possible. So if there is an opportunity for engagement, we do have an interactive component along the way. Again, I will say to the folks along the way here, if you do get cut off, if you're disconnected for any reason as part of the Zoom piece along the way, there will be a recording sent out of the entire session. So please don't feel obligated if there is an issue along the way, that we can make sure that that does happen. I would just ask that as you guys are joining here, if you could please make sure that you are muted along the way. We're happy to assist with that, but we want to make sure that we do get this recording out to everyone along following this session. So before I take any steps further with this session, Victim Services of Huron County acknowledges that the geographic area that we support is located on the traditional lands of the Ojibwe Chippewa people of the Anishinaabe group of Indigenous peoples. Huron County is on territory that is covered by Crown Treaty number 29, known as the Huron Tract Purchase of 1827. As a community, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. We recognize and deeply appreciate the Indigenous historic connection to this place and the agreement with the Crown of Canada to peaceably share and care for the resources in and around the Great Lakes. So Before we dive any further into the topic of what we're actually going to cover tonight, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes that are worth considering along the way. It is very important for me that I make sure that everyone's aware on this call that this session is recorded. We are recording anything that's coming through, whether it be audio, video, anything like that. So with that in mind, please do not feel obligated to appear on camera at any given point. I totally appreciate a level of uncomfortability with people's information being shared. We will do our best to protect the privacy, but want to ensure that this information is available to anybody who might need it. Questions can be submitted through this point through the chat or a Q&A tool. I would ask at this point that if anybody does have questions, if you could submit them directly to Anne Culligan. She is on the call tonight. She's going to be assisting as much as possible from the Huron Perth Catholic District School Board. With that, she's going to make sure that those questions come in and are moderated and stop me along the way if there is anything that might be of note or of importance that folks are interested in. We do have an interactive component tonight. Again, as much as fun as it is for me to spew information for an hour at a time, it can be very long. It can be quite boring if it's just me sharing information with you. If we're able to go back and forth a little bit, it can make things a little bit more interesting. So again, please stop me if there are questions. More importantly, please participate if there is an opportunity along the way for the interactive component. The last piece is that following this session, there will be a full recording sent out to everybody, as well as a follow-up survey, just with some feedback, trying to request and understand where the value might be for you folks along the way, and what might be helpful going forward. So please take the time to do that. I appreciate that surveys can be quite daunting sometimes. This is fairly short. It should be hopefully helpful for us to provide a better level of service and better level of care to you folks in the community going forward, to see where we can better support the educational lens through this. Before I go any further, I do want to make a note especially and thank the Huron Perth Catholic District School Board for making this session available tonight. They are the ones who spent a lot of their own time and capital to organize the session. But in the same breath, I want to welcome and thank folks joining us from all over the place. We do have folks from the Avon Maitland District School Board joining us as well. So thank you for your time tonight. We are thrilled to have you here in conjunction and in partnership. It is very important to me that this information gets out to as many people as possible, purely because our goal is to overshare this info so that someone somewhere down the line might not end up in a situation where they're needing our support. Oh, goodness, we're jumping ahead. So I do just want to make note along the way of what we're hoping to accomplish tonight. I am going to just go through, I've got some feedback along the way, so I apologize. I am going to just kind of run through the stages of human trafficking, kind of our understanding of what those might be, how we explain them to youth going forward, and how that can be successful for them. From there, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the bare bones around our understanding of the issue. And then from there, we'll jump on some of the statistical trends that we're seeing, some of the concerning pieces and things that we can do as parents, as educators, as folks that are supporting young people that might be experiencing this horrible situation. So without any further ado, what I do want to dive into right away, and I find it to be very important, is the first stage of human trafficking starts tentatively right around the same spot for most cases. Again, human trafficking is very complex in nature, but more times than not, it does start through the luring process. This is something that we tend to see as something that can be very concerning with youth. And it's a note that I want to make with everyone on this call tonight, because this tends to be where we're also able to catch the majority of these situations going forward. Generally, what's happening during the luring stage when we have these conversations is that this is where the individual who is going to do the trafficking along the way is starting to identify their target. They're trying to figure out who those individuals might be, why they might be vulnerable, and how they could potentially take advantage of them. This initial contact can come in a lot of different ways. We're seeing it more and more happen in a cyberspace, an ability for folks to connect along the way in different methods, things like Snapchat, TikTok, internet ads, things like Instagram or Facebook, which we all might have a little bit more experience with, are happening as well. But in the same breath, individuals are looking for new opportunities and ways to make contact with individuals that they might be able to take advantage of down the road. This also is where we start to see someone who is going to participate in trafficking, or is going to make note of the trafficking situation, use more manipulation techniques on the individuals they're going to target, and start to prey on insecurities. If not for anything else out of this presentation tonight, one thing that I want us all to take away is that the reality of human trafficking is that it revolves around the vulnerabilities of the individual being targeted. This could be something as simple as a roof over their head or money in their bank account, all the way through to something like fulfilling emotional needs due to a lack of structure or a lack of supports in the family, in the community, or elsewhere. This can be very complex very, very quickly, but it is something that I want us to make note of going forward. So before I go any further, I do want to start with the luring stage, but I also want to make one thing abundantly clear to everybody on this call. Human trafficking is not an urban problem. It is something that does happen right here in our community, and it does tend to start through online spaces or cyber platforms. It does happen right in our own backyard. I do have somebody, again, folks, along the way, if you don't mind, if you could just make sure that you're muted as much as possible, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. So with this being said, when we're talking about the luring stage, it's very important for us to understand that it happens in a number of different places and to a number of different people for a number of different reasons. It is very, very difficult for us to understand why human trafficking individuals are targeted, purely because there is no scope, rhyme, or reason as to why someone might be targeted for this practice. What does happen, though, is when we dial it down to this luring stage, to the beginning of the human trafficking experience, anyone who's on this call that's been fishing before understands that there's two things that come with any good fishing experience. And I'm sure that someone has either a grandfather or a parent, someone along the way that took them fishing the first time and told them they need to be patient. They also probably told them that you need to make sure that you're selecting the right lure for the job. These are the two most important and critical pieces when it comes to understanding human trafficking through the luring stage and where it might be happening. This is something that might not happen quickly. It might happen over a course of days, weeks, months, or even years. With that being said, we also understand that in this moment that human traffickers are looking for the right tool for the job. Along the way, they might be trying different approaches, things like romance, things like the promise of fame, stardom, money, any of those things, to start to manipulate some of these questions or concerns that people might have prior to engaging in that human trafficking relationship. The next stage that we often talk about with students, and one that we can often be aware of as well, is the grooming and gaming stage. This is a tough one to differentiate from that luring stage, from the beginnings of our understanding of human trafficking, because it doesn't necessarily look much different. This is where we see someone who is targeting someone in a human trafficking capacity start to feed the needs of their victim. They're going to really focus on these situations and start to target the needs of that person, whatever they might be, whether they are physical, whether they're emotional, whether they're financial, and feed them like they've never been fed before. If we're talking in a romantic space, this is where we see folks along the way talk about these situations as the honeymoon stage of a relationship, something where someone is all-encompassing of time, energy, and commitment to spaces. We tend to see young people in relationships that dive head over heels at this moment. What we often see is more manipulation techniques at this point, and is starting to establish a reliance between the individual who's doing the trafficking and the individual who is going to end up being trafficked. This is often where we're looking at situations and talking about some of the insecurities that people might have come up. Now, when I explain this part of human trafficking, or this part of the cycle that we often see, the example that I often use is I talk about horses. Again, for anyone on this call that grew up with horses before, they'll understand that horses are creatures of habit, just as humans are. Again, in the same breath, I totally appreciate that everyone on this call is at least, if not far more smart or far more intelligent than a horse along the way. With that being said, it's very important for us to understand that we tend to mimic the habits of the creatures that we surround ourselves with. If you were to show up to a stable here in Clinton, where I work at the OPP detachment, and you were to see the people caring for the horses twice a day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., they brush those horses 100 times, they clean out their stalls, and they feed them. Regardless of the situation, if someone were to show up late for work, miss those calls, or not do something that they normally do on a weekly schedule, those horses, irregardless, will show up and expect to be brushed at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. every single day. This is what the grooming and gaming stage does to young people that are being targeted along the way. They create a reliance, they create some level of system where the individual feels comfortable and confident that they are going to have their needs met over and over and over again until there's an increased reliance where that person will be the proverbial horse that shows up to get brushed every single day. This is where we start to see things start to take a bit of a turn. When I talk about this stage with students and when I share this information with young people especially, it's very difficult for us to differentiate up until this point what stage is which when we're talking about human trafficking. Again, not all stages will be accounted for in every single case of human trafficking, but it is important for us to know the signs and symptoms of each to address them along the way. This one, when we're talking about these pieces, the control and manipulation stage is a clear defining point for us, where things shift from negative to positive. When we have these conversations, when we start to address these concerns, what we see is the isolation of the victim, whether it be physically or emotionally, and the creation of false motives that would otherwise motivate the victim to act in a certain way. So what that means can be broken down into a lot of different factors. Oftentimes when we talk about human trafficking, the honest belief is, when I say isolation of a victim, that someone is locked away in a basement and never let out or allowed to leave. Oftentimes when we talk about isolation, I'm not only talking about physical isolation, so something as simple as moving out of mom and dad's house, or it could be something far more complex on an emotional level, like isolation from friends, again, change in social schedule, dropping out of recreational activities, distrust for services they might have otherwise used, things like counseling, hospital appointments, anything like that, a distrust for police or law enforcement. All of these tend to be situations that we see isolation of a victim from anyone who could potentially reach out to support them or help them along the way. This is also where we see some of these situations transpire with the creation of false motives in the emotional or physical sense. All of a sudden, things go from that idea of feeding needs and creating a reliance to some level of what we would consider to be reality, where someone comes to and has to start to realize some of the things around life, like cost. Understand that there's often a price to be paid, as someone might say. This is where we go from that idea of feeding every single need and that honeymoon stage to some of the more realistic pieces that a human trafficker will use to manipulate the situation. It's right around this time that we start to see exploitation of our victims, or the folks that are being human trafficked, right here at home. It goes from a situation where folks have lots of questions and concerns, where things go from that positive to negative, all of a sudden to a situation that is unfathomable for all of us. This is the exploitation phase that I try to explain, purely because exploitation does not necessarily jump to some of the crazy radical thoughts that we have in our own head, like forced sex work or forced labor, some of those extremes. Sometimes it starts with something a little bit smaller, something like having to pay bills, having to find a job, having to do something else to contribute in a way that might seem harmless. With that being said, that jump from that harmless situation where someone is being told that they need to find a way to pay their share, to all of a sudden having that incredibly high level of reliance that they then taken advantage of and forced into situations like circumstantial sex work, like massage work, like dancing exotically, some of these other concerns that we see in the sex trafficking piece, is not a far jump. All of a sudden, this is something that we see individuals from our towns, from our communities, engaging in practices that they would have never otherwise taken part in. Exploitation is something that's very important for us all to understand, especially with the youth that we work with, purely because our understanding of exploitation needs to be a little bit simplified, purely based on what we think it is. Oftentimes, when we look at exploitation, we might have a certain idea of what that looks like in our head. But if we're able to simplify to a point of understanding that a decision-making process is changed or altered purely based on someone's best practice, again, what they would have normally done is not what they're currently doing because of an influence from somewhere else along the way. This is something that we need to consider when we're talking about the exploitation piece, because that slight exploitation can sometimes lead to a much larger stage down the road. Now, I want to take a natural breaking point here because we are about 20 minutes into the session. So is there any questions up to this point about any of the stages I previously discussed? I have one more stage that I hope to discuss with you that is kind of coming at the tail end of most human trafficking situations. But I do want to make sure that of this information that we're sharing, when we are sharing this with youth, these are the stages that we're talking about and trying to raise some of the concerns around red flags, around things to be aware of, things that we can look for in our friends, in the folks that we're supporting, and things to be aware of going forward. Does anybody have any questions? Or if you do, could you please just forward them to Anne at this point, and we'll take just a brief moment to make sure that there aren't any. I will also say, please totally understand there is absolutely an opportunity for questions at the end if folks are uncomfortable at this point. Likewise, I will make my own contact information available if you're not comfortable asking in a group setting. I want to ensure that we do have every opportunity for more answers than questions leaving this session. And how are we making out at this point? None yet. Perfect. That's awesome. Well, I will keep rolling along at this point. If there are any, please don't be afraid to stop me along the way. Again, I totally appreciate this is information overload, but it's very important for me that we get this information out to you folks so that you understand what's being shared with the youth in our system and also understand what we can look for going forward. So the last stage that I want to talk about during the human trafficking cycle that we often see is the recruitment stage. Now, this might sound a little bit backwards, and again, I'm sure there's some folks on this call that believe that this could potentially sit at the start of the situation. Absolutely. Debbie, thank you so much for your question. We do have stats to events in Huron and Perth area. I will absolutely go over that in just a little while. Again, this is part of the wonders of getting to do this presentation is unfortunately some people dovetail me into the next slide way ahead of everything else. So I will absolutely speak to you as much as I can without identifiers, some of the stats that we see in our area when it comes to statistics around human trafficking. Thank you for your question though. I really appreciate that. So with that being said, the recruitment stage is the last piece that I want to talk about, just based on the stages of human trafficking that are important for us to cover. And the recruitment stage comes on the tail end because what we often see is situations where someone has been victimized, where they've been taken advantage of or put through that exploitation stage. And it gets to a point where it becomes a means of survival for them to find a way out. And when we talk about finding a way out, this is often something that's far more complex than a situation that might deem. Again, unfortunately, this is not something where someone wakes up one day, decides they want help, and leaves a human trafficking situation. It's often a very tedious process with a number of touch points and a number of different complicated pieces that are required to get them away from the individual that's doing the trafficking, and even better yet, to hopefully have them pursue some legal action against that person. But what we see in the recruitment stage is someone who's been taken advantage of and has been put through this situation, put through this cycle for anywhere from weeks to months to years at a time. And then what they tend to do is they look for an out, an escape hatch, that big red button on the wall, a parachute that they can pull to say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. When I'm explaining this to youth, I often compare it to a summer job that they might have, because I often have someone who is not overly thrilled to be doing it. Maybe they cut grass, maybe they work in a restaurant, something that seems fairly simple or something that we might have all done at some point in our careers. With that being said, when I start to change some of the dynamics around that, and I say that instead of cutting grass for minimum wage as a student, you now cut grass for 23 hours a day and receive no pay for it. You don't get to sleep, you don't get to eat or see your family or any of those wonderful things. The first thing that a student will say to me is, there's no way I'm doing that. When I have these conversations, this is also the point where these individuals are the first one to say that they don't care who replaces them in doing that role. If I were to say to them that all they have to do to find a different space to get out of that situation is find someone to replace them, they tend not to care right then and there when it comes to things like cutting grass or working in a restaurant. Comparatively, when we start to talk about human trafficking, if someone has experienced years of sexual abuse, years of forced labor, years of any sort of this exploitation that we commonly see, this is something where we often see folks not necessarily being willing to care about who they put in harm's way to replace in that situation. This is where they tend to recruit other individuals who could step into that space. Could be friends, could be parents, could be sisters, could be children of the individual that's been victimized. And what they do is they're purely doing this as a means of survival, a means to remove themselves from that situation, to get away from the exploitation they've been facing, and to try and find a way out of that piece. With that being said, it's very important for us to understand at this point that not only does it remove them from the situation as the individual being exploited, but it also removes the human trafficker from the legal sense. At this point, now the person that has been put through the ringer, that has been groomed and gamed, that has been controlled and manipulated, that is now exploited time and time again, is actually the individual doing the luring for the next individual who might come into a human trafficking situation. What we see with this is that the trafficker is still going to collect their money. They're still going to be the ones making a profit on the backside of this, but they actually remove themselves from some of the legal jeopardy associated because they might not ever have contact with their next victim. It could be someone who's already been put through this process that then starts to build upon itself. Again, looking for a way out, bringing someone else in. That individual becomes exploited, looks for a way out, and brings someone else in. All of a sudden, this individual who is now taking part in something that's absolutely very illegal in human trafficking is removed from the picture, and police have no idea who's behind it all. This tends to be one of the complicated matters that we talk about when it comes to the recruitment phase of human trafficking. Now, when I talk about human trafficking, I talk about the stages purely because there's a number of red flags that we can tend to identify when it comes to manipulation techniques, the honeymoon stage, some of those pieces along the way. But it's also very important for us to understand the individuals right here in our counties, in Huron and Perth, who are actually doing the human trafficking. Again, it is not, unfortunately, these individuals that we see that appear as Bond villains on TV or have a cool scar under their eye or are evil masterminds. What we often see, unfortunately, is a number of people who look and sound and function just as you or I would. What I've done for today is I've taken our statistics from the last few years and I've tried to kind of create what I'm going to call stereotypes, things that we can look for, things to be aware of in individuals that are doing human trafficking or are being the perpetrators of human trafficking right here in our region. The first one I'm going to talk about, I call him the Romeo, or the boy next door. Now, when we talk about this is really important for us to understand because the majority of individuals that are human trafficked, especially in our region, identify that the person doing the trafficking is actually their partner, their boyfriend, their husband, someone that they're romantically connected to. What we see is that this starts through that luring stage in a romantic sense, things like dating apps, things like reaching out to someone that they might already know in a friendly sense, in a friendly capacity, and starting to use romance to charm or take advantage of their victim. Again, this gets really complicated really quickly, but especially when I'm speaking with youth, one of the main identifying points that I make note of is any boyfriend or girlfriend who is more keen to take advantage of insecurities than anything else. When I talk about that, the individual or the boyfriend who is suggesting moving out from mom and dad's house, the individual who's trying to absorb the majority of their partner's time, this is something that's very important for us to understand along the way. The boy next door, the Romeo, is the majority of the human trafficking that we see right here in our region. Now, there's a couple of other stereotypes that I want to talk about. The next one being what I call the CEO. This is one that's come out of COVID. It's come fairly frequently, especially because of the use of technology going forward. I call them the CEO because that's exactly what they appear as in a cyberspace. They appear as someone with lots of money, lots of pull, the ability to influence situations, make someone famous. Again, what we often see is that pushy agent vibe from someone engaging with somebody across cyberspace. Instagram or Facebook are two big spots that we see this happen, but we've seen it happen from everywhere from LinkedIn to Kijiji to all sorts of different ads where it does appear to be some level of business proposition. Someone is coming forward with some level of idea that they are going to make you money, make you famous, make you somehow better in some way because of what they have the ability to offer you. Now, this is one that I like to talk about, especially with young students, purely because many of them have Instagram accounts, many of them have Facebook accounts, or are using some sort of app along the way, things like TikTok, Snapchat, all of those wonderful apps in between. So when we're talking about these apps, it's very important for us to understand that oftentimes there will be individuals posing as companies, whether it be clothing companies or bikini companies, that will reach out, especially to vulnerable young people, with messages along the lines of, hey, we would love for you to work for us, model for us, be an ambassador somewhere along the way. And oftentimes it'll have something along the lines of, you're the most beautiful individual we've ever seen. We would love if you would model our clothing. We'd love if you'd model our bikinis. We'd love if you'd model whatever else. At this point, this is arguably the most interesting part of the presentation for me because I get to explain to young people along the way that those girls that are receiving messages asking them to model bikinis, that unfortunately the police and folks like myself are receiving the same messages. Now, for the sake of everyone's eyes on this call, I will not be wearing a bikini as part of this presentation, but please understand along the way that when they send these messages out, they're sending them to 10,000 people a day, regardless of age, regardless of gender, purely looking for one person that has some level of vulnerability or some desire to be rich or famous. This is where we start to see one person respond who says, you know what, maybe I would be a good model. Maybe I do want to be famous. Maybe I do want to make some extra money. And they start that process in which they're then eventually taken advantage of by someone that they've never met through a cyberspace. The last type of individual that does human trafficking in our region that I would like to talk about tonight, especially, is the one that I call the King Kong. This is a very large stereotype, but I'm sure many of us on the call can think back to that old movie where the giant gorilla crawls up on the building and holds on to the little girl while the plane is flying around them. We all have that image of the big gorilla roar, and we think about how kind of intimidating it was in that first moment. The King Kong trafficker is exactly what it sounds like. Someone that is intimidating in nature, that is meant to cause a scene, that makes everyone uncomfortable. When we talk about this, this is the individual that we see in movies, that we see on TV, that is using blackmail, that is using threats of violence, that is using kidnapping as part of their practice for human trafficking. This is actually not as frequent as we see with the Romeo or the boyfriend, the guy next door. But what we do see is sometimes, especially in Huron and Perth counties, is that sometimes the traffickers will tend to mold between a couple of these types of traffickers. They might start off and appear as the Romeo or the boyfriend, who's someone who's very favorable, filling romantic needs, caring for that individual and taking up most of their time. But then all of a sudden will start to shift based on their threats, based on blackmail, based on social pressures along the way to try and take advantage of that person. Likewise, all of a sudden that CEO who's promising money or fame starts to get a little bit pushy. They start to care less about the intentions or the desires of the person that they're working with and start to impose more situations, things like threats. With this is very important for us to understand that all of these individuals are malleable. All of these individuals don't necessarily start and end in the same place, but for the sake of this presentation, I am hoping that these stereotypes allow for us to recognize some of the dangers that come along with each of the individuals committing human trafficking right here at home. So when we're dealing with human trafficking especially, it's very important for us to understand when we're talking about the gorilla trafficker, the King Kong trafficker, that with this situation, sometimes this is someone who might present in a very different way. They're not going to out and out come out with threats of violence or blackmail right away. This might be the individual who stereotypically is someone who shows up with a big truck and offers to pick up younger students and offers to drive them around, offers to give rides to a party, provides substances underage, things like alcohol, drugs, marijuana, all of those things in a friendly sense. It was when this starts to complicate that things get a little bit different for us with this trafficker. This goes from someone who is friendly, who is the life of the party and is that older friend that can help out in situations and can be very trusted by young people, to someone who has the ability to influence, blackmail, and deal with situations in a less than favorable way. One other note that I would like to make, especially along the way, is that I totally appreciate that when we talk about human trafficking, many people immediately think of large urban centers. They think of problems in Toronto, they think about Ottawa, they think about Montreal, East and West Coast, purely because of the belief that this is an international problem. But what I'd like to do is just draw our attention to a strip of land that it becomes very, very important in the human trafficking landscape, especially in Huron County. I've worked on a number of different cases with a number of different people from different multidisciplinary teams, everyone from hospitals to schools to police officers to support individuals who are experiencing human trafficking. Somewhere, regardless of the situation, we always tend to end up talking about the 401 corridor. Now, the 401 corridor is this wonderful stretch that connects all of these wonderful cities right throughout our province, everywhere from Toronto to London, through to Sarnia, all the way to Niagara region, without issue. The 401 corridor is where we see a huge issue when it comes to the human trafficking platform right here in our province, purely because of the ability for individuals to travel and transport unchecked, unmaintained, and unaccounted for in very, very quick situations. This is something where we see individuals who will start in Toronto, start in London, end up in Ottawa overnight. They'll end up in Sarnia one weekend, and then they'll end up working in Toronto the next. These are situations that tend to be very concerning for us when we're talking about human trafficking. And one of the red flags that we often look for is the individuals that are surfacing in these places for no rhyme or reason in very, very short durations, 2 or 3 days in one spot, 2 or 3 days in the next, all the way along, because we believe along these pathways that this is kind of the what we would call the human trafficking circuit. Now, I totally appreciate that there is someone on this call somewhere that is far too respectful to actually say anything in this moment, but they're saying somewhere in the back of their head, Dawson, we don't live in the 401 corridor. What does that have to do with me? So I do want to make note, I work out of Clinton, out of the Huron OPP detachment here. But with that being said, let's just take a quick moment and ponder to yourself, the last time you went out for a date night, where did you go? The last time you went to Costco, where did you go? If you wanted to go to the movie theater, if you wanted to go to a larger shopping center, most of us frequent along the way London, Kitchener, Toronto without even thinking of it. For all of us on the call that are invested in working with youth, Where do our youth go to post-secondary education? Sarnia, London, Kitchener, Toronto. This corridor is very accessible for all of us right here in Huron. It is only spitting distance to the region, and as such allows for massive overflows of human trafficking situations to happen right in our own hometowns, purely based on proximity. We are so close that we don't often consider that urban problems tend to spill up into our rural communities without us even thinking about it. Now, I also appreciate there's some folks on the call tonight that might be in Perth County somewhere. I have worse news for you folks. Unfortunately, you're even closer to this corridor. So with that being said, we do tend to see situations where this overflow does happen into places like Listowel, places like Stratford. Again, it's kind of a weak joke, but I grew up outside of Wingham and we always considered Listowel the halfway point to Kitchener. With that being said, it's often easy for us to look at those situations and say that all of a sudden that 30-minute drive becomes nothing when we're dealing with situations like this, where people have invested weeks, months, and years into the exploitation of a victim. Again, at this point, this is where I'd like to talk a little bit about statistics, especially around things like how much money comes from these situations. Someone that's being human trafficked in Ontario is actually profiting for their trafficker about $250,000 a year, depending on the person. So if an individual is human trafficking 4 individuals, they're making $1 million a year off of those folks. With that being said, $1 million a year in profit is nothing to turn our noses up at when we're dealing with these problems along the way. And as such, having access to this 401 corridor becomes increasingly important for them to make sure that no one has the ability to, 1, figure out where individuals are long enough to help them, and 2, make sure that they are not connected to or in the scope of the same regional law enforcement for too long for these problems to be addressed. Now, at this point, I do just want to take a moment to, again, address any concerns or questions that might have come in regarding the 401 corridor or some of those pieces. Again, the reason why I bring this up, the reason why I make note of it during this session tonight is as we support youth, as we look for the best opportunity going forward to find ways for us to ensure that we're trying to support the youth in our community the best we can, it's very important for us to make note of some of these places when they are frequenting them in unusual travel patterns. It is very rare for us to have someone that starts the week in Sarnia, pops up in London midweek, and is in Ottawa before the weekend. All of these things, when we have contact with these individuals, are things that we need to consider and make note of along the way. Does anybody have any questions about anything we've covered so far this session? Perfect. We'll keep chugging along here. And if there are questions, please stop me along the way. It's very important for me that, again, likewise, I want to ensure that you guys have answers, not questions when you leave tonight's session. So what I want to do at this point in the session is I want to offer you a little bit of an opportunity to understand how we can do a better job collectively as a community in supporting people as they come forward with human trafficking disclosures. This is something that's really heavy for a lot of us, as oftentimes we feel like we're unprepared. We feel like we should not be the ones dealing with this. And as a result, we should dial 911 now. We should call police, and that's the solution. That's the answer. That's the right thing to do. I don't necessarily disagree with that opinion, but it is important for me that we take some of the right steps to ensure that we get every opportunity to support these individuals going forward. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to ask all of you folks, I appreciate that everybody that's on this call is here because they're interested in learning, but think back to some of the more recent touches that you've had probably regarding mental health. Mental health has been a bit of a hot button issue for us recently, especially when it comes to supporting youth along the way. And we tend to take a very specific approach to how we work through conversations when someone approaches us and discloses that they're struggling with their mental health. When we talk about human trafficking, the disclosure process is actually very similar, and we can sort of follow a similar blueprint for success to work through some of these challenges so that we're not feeling as if we are unprepared, that we're not sure what we should be doing, that we're just not sure what's next. We can do the same thing when someone's talking about human trafficking as we do if they were to approach us and talk about self-harm or potential suicide concerns or potential mental health diagnoses that they have concerns about. Regardless of the topic, especially when we're talking about human trafficking, what we say really does matter. This is where things start to really impact us because we really have to do a good job of validating the disclosure in that moment. Similar to a mental health situation, if you had someone approach you and say, I've been really struggling lately with my own mental health, generally the first words that come out of people's mouths along the way are something along the lines of, thank you so much for telling me. That must have been really difficult to hear, really difficult to say. This is important for us to do as well when we're talking about a human trafficking disclosure, purely because, again, it is incredibly challenging for someone to feel comfortable and feel confident enough to be able to bring forward that concern to an individual they trust, much less folks that they don't. So if you are that teacher, if you are that parent, if you are that individual that has that situation brought to you, first and foremost, that response of, I'm not sure what to do with this, it's sitting a little uneasy with me, might not be the best solution. But instead, we can always start with the validating where they're at, validating that disclosure and thanking them for bringing that to us. The second thing that we're going to do is remove any notion of blame. Now, I have a couple of incredible mental health professionals on the call that work in this school, in Katie and Anne and Catherine Boyd. We have some awesome people that work with some of these students along the way. And I promise you, regardless of how our teachers might have treated us way back when in a different life, none of them say to those students, well, you silly kid, why do you feel that way? That's not what they're doing when someone brings forward a mental health concern. What they're going to do is remove any notion of blame and make them feel as if they have every right to come forward with that story. This is something that we also want to do along the way. Victim blaming is incredibly dangerous, and we see it happen often when it comes to our legal process. Again, I call it a legal system, not a justice system, for a reason. With that being said, my goal when we have these conversations is to try and create an environment in which victims feel safe to bring these situations forward. With that, we have to remove any notion of blame, that they've done anything wrong that allows for them to be in this situation. It is very easy for us to point fingers along the way and say, well, you shouldn't have dated that boy, you shouldn't have got into that truck, you shouldn't have been involved in that situation, and as a result, we're now here. But in the same breath, we also need to be very aware that none of that is actually helpful, and that it's actually someone who's doing a far better job of manipulating that individual's actions, decisions, and outcomes that leads to these situations, not the fact that they chose to date someone that might not be a great match. That is not their fault. It's someone who is far better and far more prepared, looking to take advantage of a situation. The next thing that we need to do is we need to walk the path with them. Oftentimes, when we talk about disclosures, whether it be through mental health or through human trafficking, we're very, very quick to want to call police, to want to wash our hands of a situation or get it into the hands of a professional. Now, this isn't necessarily because we are bad people or believe that we're doing something wrong, but because we don't necessarily agree or trust in the fact that we need to be doing something in a certain way. What we need to do in this moment when these disclosures come forward is meet somebody where they're at and lay out their options for them along this process. This is very important for us to do because oftentimes the solution that we believe, which will lead right into my next point, is not the best path forward. We really do need to check our biases and check our assumptions as to what we believe an outcome should look like, what we believe should happen next, or who we believe needs to know about these situations, and instead figure out where that person is at, what they're identifying as needs in that moment, and then work with them to lay out a path to success. And again, the path to success might not be one that we agree with, that we like, or that we're comfortable with in that moment, but it's one that leads to their safety inevitably, or leads to a situation where they are removed from that lifestyle. That is our goal. In the same breath along the way, this is not my moment of saying, don't call the police, don't tell the police. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that inevitably, we tend to dial 911 before we even hear the end of the story. In this moment, sometimes we need to take a few moments and ensure that that person feels heard, feels supported, understands their options. And from there, we're able to start the next process as to how we get them out of that situation, one way or another. The last piece that we need to do when we have these disclosures brought forward to us is recognize what a win looks like. This is very important for us on this call because oftentimes we feel very helpless. We're not really sure what to do. We feel like that we've let someone down because these individuals are experiencing this and they've brought it to us in this moment. Likewise, of the police officers that I work with, many of them did not get into the field to let the bad guy get away, to not deal with the bad guy in that moment or address their concerns. But when we're dealing with human trafficking, we have to play by a little bit of a different rule set. For us, the biggest win is safety. If that person feels safe to tell you that they're experiencing something, safe to begin exiting that lifestyle, or safe to remove themselves from that situation with our help, that is a far larger win than anything else we could ever hope for. With that being said, the wins will look a little bit different for everyone, regardless of the situation. I hope of every human trafficking case that I ever touch, that guy goes to jail, because I believe that human trafficking is one of the most heinous crimes you can ever do. You strip an individual of all personal dignity and it results in their exploitation over and over and over again. With that being said, there are times where we have to swallow our pride and understand that a call to police might not be the best situation right away, that our biases and assumptions might actually lead to someone being in more danger, and instead that we have to kind of figure out what works best for that person in that moment to ensure they feel safe, they feel supported, and that their needs are met, to ensure that they have every opportunity to walk out of that situation supported and feeling like they have a fighting chance to return to a normal life someday. That is what I'm talking about when I look at recognizing what a win looks like along the way. So I am going to make just a couple of final points, and then we will have an opportunity along the way for some engagement back and forth. So hopefully this will be the last of you hearing information being overloaded in your direction from me. But some final points that I want us to walk away with from this session and things that we share. These are the core messages that we're trying to get out to youth, especially when we're doing the work that we do in the school boards, in the community, alongside all of our stakeholders to try and make this problem sort of disappear from our homes. First one is that human trafficking is illogical in nature. This is very important for us to understand because it comes with a level of assumptions and bias that we often look at and say, why is that happening? It shouldn't happen. It's not right. We don't agree with it. It's very important for us to understand that it is not something that often makes sense. Very regularly, we see these individuals lead to situations where they do things that don't make sense, that we don't agree with, or that contradict our understanding of how society should function. If we can operate from that perspective and that mindset, it does allow for us to try and increase the level of support available because we're not spending our time trying to reason our way out of situations, but instead looking for solutions. Again, reason will kill a human trafficking situation immediately. We will never be able to support that person if we are focusing on what makes sense and what should happen. Instead, we need to operate from the basis that human trafficking in its nature is illogical. It doesn't make sense and it's not going to make sense. That's why we need to take a different approach and look for creative out-of-the-box solutions to lay out the path for that person to try and give them the opportunity to succeed. With that being said, this goes hand in hand with the next point, that the needs of the individual that we're supporting, whether they're perceived or real, if it's a real need or it's something that they believe in their own head, must be a priority. The only opportunity for someone to exit a human trafficking situation is if all of their needs are met. If they are a substance user, regardless of how uncomfortable we might be with the idea of someone using substances, again, I'm not talking about smoking weed behind a school. I'm not talking about drinking underage at a party. I'm saying if we have individuals that are using heroin, methamphetamine, serious substances, that their needs need to be met or they will never leave the trafficker that they're working with. Things like a roof over your head, things like food in your belly, money in your bank account, social services or connections, family or friends that they can go to if they have a question or a challenge. All of these needs, perceived or real, must be a priority for us. If we do not meet every single one, that individual will 100% return to the life that they are previously living. They will return to their trafficker, return to that situation if they feel their needs are not met. This goes into the next piece. Survivor buy-in, involvement, and choices must be a priority. Sometimes 911 is not the answer right away. I'm not saying that it won't be the answer, that we won't involve police along the way where it makes sense to try and support them, to make sure that they're safe, to make sure that that individual is charged down the road, the bad guy. But their buy-in, the person that's having this happen to them, their involvement and their choices have to be a priority for us. This goes hand in hand with the understanding of needs. We need to understand that those needs must be met and that their buy-in and their involvement in some of the choices that they're making leads to a more sustainable path to success. The next thing is that assumptions and biases must be managed. Oh, sorry, Anne, is there a question that's popped up?
Yeah, maybe Dawson, I'll just interject with a question we have from Brad, just because it's related to what you're discussing here. So Brad is wondering if you can provide some examples of what scenarios would warrant not contacting police right away, as you mentioned. So after learning of any level of this happening or trafficking happening. Yeah, and would they decide how to move forward with it? Like, I guess maybe, and Brad, you can clarify this, but maybe if we're not contacting police, you know, what are we doing? What would that look like? Or the scenarios where we would not contact police?
So I just want to clarify first and foremost, I have the same duty to report that educational professors or professions do when it comes to a duty or an obligation to report things to law enforcement or to child protection agencies when we're dealing with youth especially. So I have the same kind of background when it comes to that piece, and I totally appreciate that it can be concerning to not call police right away. But there are situations where sometimes calling police, especially if that individual is not ready or willing to exit that lifestyle right away, can actually be more harmful than it can be helpful. Because what will happen is if Anne makes a call from the school, she has a disclosure, that individual is not ready to exit the lifestyle. They fear for their own safety. They fear for the safety of someone else. They don't believe that they're being trafficked or that they're a victim. And they call police, and then police come and knock on that individual's door and do a wellness check. And that person says, I'm fine. And then police leave. They go, this person's fine. They said they're okay. They said they're in an okay situation. They leave that situation. We've now actually complicated the matter further by involving police and potentially put them in harm's way with their trafficker. What happens is we tend to take a far more subtle approach. And again, this is where I have to really do put an asterisk beside that point, because just because we are not dialing 911 right away does not mean we're not going to involve police. It just means that the way that we do it might be a little bit different. We might not have a 911 call placed, but it might be a consultation with a human trafficking specific detective and folks from my team to try and figure out how we can best support this person, to whether it be showing up in unmarked cars and plain clothing, or meeting them at school, or meeting them in their workplace and getting them a cell phone so that they can then make calls for their own safety to us that their human trafficker, that the person that's taking advantage of them, is not aware of. It could be like something, getting someone the basic necessities that they need, something like a $50 gift card to Walmart so that they can go buy diapers for their child. All of a sudden, if they feel like their child is supported in that moment, rather than calling police to kick the door down and pull everybody out through the side, which is what I would love to see. It would be really awesome if we could live in an action movie all the time. Instead, that individual now feels that someone out there cares about them, that has the interests of their, again, if it's a child or a youth, whatever needs might be, again, perceived or real. If those needs are met, all of a sudden they are now not going to their trafficker for those same needs. They feel as if they can now take a step away from that lifestyle, away from some of those choices, again, towards a path that might be a little bit better that we might agree with. What I will say is there is nothing wrong with having hypothetical conversations with law enforcement. Oftentimes, I do it multiple times a week where I say, I'm in a situation where I could use some guidance. I'm not calling 911 and giving you the name and details and all of those wonderful things that lead to a number of problems, but hypothetical conversations on how we can best provide support to someone can lead to large levels of success. And again, we're more than happy to help out with that as well. Anybody can call our office 24/7, 365 days a year. I always say if they came up with a 25th hour, you could call us then too. And we're happy to work through some hypothetical conversations to try and make sure that folks feel supported. The danger comes when folks press and rush to 911 as a solution, rather than understanding what the needs might be and what some of the complicating factors might be around that person's safety, around where they're currently at in that journey, what their understanding of the situation is. Again, a huge problem for us, and we all have that situation. I'm sure many people on this call have had a coffee in the morning, and then you realize you go into a meeting or you go into somewhere else and someone goes, hey, you have some coffee breath. And you go, oh my goodness, I have coffee breath. But it's not something that's on our mind or that we think about in that moment. We deal with human trafficking victims all the time that will go years where they believe they're working for money, that they're engaging in practices that are beneficial along the way. And then someone goes, did you know this is human trafficking? And they go, oh my goodness, this is human trafficking. And it's similar to that coffee breath analogy. So with that, it's very important for us to make note of this along the way, because again, there is no one size fits all solution. It's very important for us to kind of take the opportunities that we get in a helpful way, rather than as much as cool as it would be. I really wish we had video somewhere of somebody booting down a door and coming in like an action hero, but sometimes we have to kind of take a more indirect approach to support along the way. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I hope that it kind of hits on some of those elements. So there's a couple of other last points before we kind of work through some of the engagement pieces. The next one is that we have to, again, it's just a reminder that we have to manage our biases and assumptions. Again, our understanding of the systems and supports that might be available might not be where we need it to be for that moment or that case. I'm a big fan of collaboration. I'm a firm believer that the more opinions that we can have in a situation, the better, especially when it comes to being able to work through hypothetical solutions. Again, if we have questions, if we have concerns, we do not need to involve the world in making sure that one person is supported, but there is nothing wrong with having multiple hypothetical conversations to understand the options available. This goes into the next piece, which is how we have these conversations really does matter. Whether we're having it with police, whether we're having it with someone experiencing human trafficking, or other support people in our own lives, whether it be parents, teachers, social services staff, whatever else it might be, it's very important for us to be wary of how we have these conversations, because all of this will impact our opportunities for success. This leads to the last one, and the last point that I want to leave us with is that understand that opportunities for intervention in human trafficking cases are incredibly limited. If we have an individual where things do not necessarily go well, and we have such situations that blow up in our face, unfortunately, whether we like to admit it or not, we might not hear from that person for some time, if we hear from them again. If someone brings forward a human trafficking disclosure to someone and feels confident that they're safe to do so, we only get so many opportunities to try and help that person and make sure that that person feels supported. The biggest thing that I will say with this, Katie, you got a hand up there?
Sorry, Dawson, I was just going to wait till you were done. With all of your explanation here and with the question around the duty to report, I just wanted to put in a plug that from how you've described this, and when you're talking about the conversations matter, interventions are limited, being aware of where we are at and how we're showing up in those conversations, you're not saying to go against anybody's duty to report. What you're saying is, when we do make those reports, it might be helpful to start with a hypothetical conversation and to find out or learn more about the appropriate service pathway that will meaningfully be able to help and intervene with that particular child, youth, or that situation. And sometimes we perceive that if we contact police, that response will be immediate and will be helpful and supportive. And what I hear and what you've explained is that that's the traditional way of how we think about things. And it's not about not reporting. We would still encourage everybody to report any concern that arises, but that the response to that may not be what we anticipate from law enforcement or child protection services.
Absolutely. Again, the reason why I say do or do not report is because I think that that piece, again, lies in your profession and what your duties to report are. I still have the same duty to report, like I said, so oftentimes I will be reporting some of these situations when they do come forward, but the way that we do it is the way that matters, right? We take a different approach. We might, again, indirectly have hypothetical conversations. Sometimes it's reporting to a supervisor asking for a second opinion when we're looking for those situations, especially in the schools. There's no such thing as a negative situation in asking for help, right? Again, not necessarily passing the situation off because we're uncomfortable with it, but asking for help can often be a huge point, especially around duty to report, because it can get a little bit complicated. I totally appreciate in a profession where we are supporting youth and there is levels of vulnerability, we do have a duty to look out for those people. It's just the way that we do it really does matter, especially when we're dealing with human trafficking. So that kind of just leads to my last point when we're talking about understanding that opportunities for intervention are limited. If you have questions or if you're not sure in any moment, it's more important to me that we have some of those answers available. We do our best to put out some training resources along the way. So there are other recordings of trainings and sessions like tonight where we try to raise awareness. But when we understand that opportunities for intervention are limited, we want to make sure that we're maximizing those opportunities to support people along the way. This is really important to me going forward. So if you do end up in a situation where you're even remotely questioning where things might be going, if you're able to ask for help, if we're able to help support you in what might be next, what those next steps might look like. Again, I will again give credit to our educators that we have on this call tonight. The policies that you folks have in place are top shelf. They are very, very well written and very, very explanatory of how we can address some of these concerns. So again, being able to fall back and rely on some of those can be very, very helpful as well. So I'm just going to change gears a little bit here. I do have a situation that I'm hoping to share with you folks along the way. This will be the most interactive part of the presentation. And again, rather than boring you with numbers, I figured it's a little bit more fun for us all to engage along the way. So if you just want to grab your phone, your laptop, whatever else, and if you head to www.menti.com, you can join in. in this, it's fun for us to play back and forth. Again, you don't have to associate your name with it, but it does allow for us to kind of engage in a way that makes it a little bit more entertaining than me reading statistics to you. So if anybody wants to join in, you're more than welcome to at this point, and then we can actually start through a little bit more of a game aspect to understand how this happens in our area. And again, what happens is when you go to menti.com, you'll be prompted to enter a little code up at the top. It is 27911852. Awesome. I love that there's people joining in all right away. That's great. I will just give you a minute if you folks do want to hop on with us. It's a super engaging way to do it. If not, again, I totally appreciate it if you just want to follow along as well. So you still will be able to join in as we go here. The code will remain at the top of the screen. What I'm going to ask at this point is that if folks have interest along the way in just entering something that they've kind of taken away from tonight, one word that's kind of sticking with you when it comes to the human trafficking piece, something that might be valuable for you folks along the way. This is awesome. I love this because it becomes a fun little summary for me to understand what's sticking along the way. Lots of folks on here, I'm seeing things like illogical vulnerabilities, everyone, sad, terrifying. Absolutely. I don't disagree with any of the words that are up here. Some of the ones that are really important to me that I see that I really appreciate are things like awareness. Some of these non-judgmental. These are all things that can be very, very helpful when we're trying to understand what might be helpful going forward, because all of these pieces play key roles in our understanding of human trafficking. And if we can take one word that works for us from this and works with our understanding, we can be a little bit better at trying to support individuals that come out of it. If we have awareness in the back of our head, every time human trafficking comes up, we tend to focus on how we can be more aware of the situation we're focusing on. If it's the word judgmental or non-judgmental, all of a sudden we take that approach into the things that we do. Things like readiness, so that we're ready to go when this disclosure does come to us. All of these things are very, very positive going forward. So we've got 10 players. So this will be the first question for you folks along the way. The faster you answer, the more points you get. Unfortunately, there's no leaderboard at the end. True or false, human trafficking does happen in Huron and Perth counties. Everybody's voted. Awesome. So let's see what results we have. Absolutely. At this point, it's 100% true. We have this problem happening right here in our backyard. That's why we're here. That's why we're having these conversations. We are trying to do a better job of getting on top of it and addressing some of these concerns as they arise, trying to proactively address concerns with our youth, especially in the schools, because we do see it happen right here. It is happening in Exeter. It is happening in Stratford. It's happening in Goderich, in Clinton, and Zurich, and Dundalk, and all of these wonderful little communities in Huron, Perth counties in that west coast of Ontario that we might not necessarily agree with. So question 2, we're up to 18 players. I love this. I love when people are on board with this. It's great. If I believe someone is experiencing human trafficking, I should call the police ASAP. True or false? False. You're absolutely right. Again, that doesn't mean that we don't call police. I want to echo this sentiment along the way. It doesn't mean that police will not be involved in this process, but it does mean that dialing 911 should not be our first step necessarily. We need to understand what we're working with, where our duties come in to report, and what resources might be available to ensure that we're supporting somebody along the way. Oftentimes when I do this presentation, I have more people than not that actually say unsure, and that's quite okay. There's a reason why unsure is a great answer as well, because depending on the case, sometimes it is black and white, and sometimes we will be making that call to police that day in that moment. But with that being said, the reason why I want to make note of this is because, again, looking at where we're at, how we have the conversation matters, not necessarily the fact that we will or will not have it, but how we approach it tends to be a little bit different depending on the case-by-case basis. Question 3. What percentage of survivors identify their partner as their trafficker? Awesome. So we're kind of all over the board a little bit with this one. So the reason why I make note of this one is because it is incredibly high. The number of people, especially in our area, that identify right here in our province, what percentage of their trafficking that's happening is happening through someone who is posing in a romantic relationship, a boyfriend, a partner, someone that's engaging on a romantic level. These are things that become very increasingly important for us to be aware of. And it also becomes increasingly important for us as the individuals working with youth to be aware of the state of their relationships. Again, I'm not asking anybody to be nosy and be diving headfirst into their youth's lives, but in the same breath, we all tend to have that gut feeling in our stomach about what a healthy relationship should or shouldn't look like. And if things start to steer in an unhealthy direction, we can start to ask some more questions that might otherwise help us down the road. So at this point, 85% of people in the last year that reported human trafficking province-wide reported their trafficker to be their partner. So 85% of the time, that's that Romeo, that boyfriend, that person that is posing under that romantic guise to engage somewhere. This is a really tough question. Which demographic is most likely to be charged with human trafficking offenses? And when I say demographic, are we looking at age, gender, location, rural, urban? Which one's it going to be? Somewhere in there. So yeah, the correct answer that we see is young women are actually the ones that are being charged criminally with most of the criminal offenses when it comes to human trafficking directly. The reason why this happens, there's a couple of different reasons. The first is that recruitment piece that we talked about during the stages of human trafficking, where an individual has been exploited, has been put through these situations, has experienced all of this stuff, and is now looking for a way out, and as a result, bring someone in. This is something that we see happen very, very often. Gender is a big one when we talk about, again, gender and crimes. This is not to say, when we're talking about this presentation, that there are not male human trafficking victims, but based on the arrest reports from last year, when we're talking about human trafficking related charges, most individuals charged are young women between the ages of 15 and 30. So when we're talking about that, it is young women that have been put through this cycle that are looking for a way out. Now, with that being said, there's often a number of associated charges that are laid in human trafficking investigations, and I'll talk a little bit about that with the next question, but it's important for us to understand that I'm only talking in this moment about human trafficking charges. So this will be the next question here. What percentage of people trafficked in Canada are Canadian? Awesome. The correct answer is actually 70%. We see 7 out of every 10 individuals that are reported human trafficking cases that happen along the way. We see situations where this happens where it is not foreign individuals. It is people right here that are born in our communities, that are born and raised in Huron and Perth County, that are trafficked in Huron and Perth County. When we talk about domestic human trafficking, the percentage of people trafficked in Canada is 70%. Again, there's 30% outliers. Again, most of that happens in the east and west coast, things like Nova Scotia, places like British Columbia, other human trafficking hotbeds. But in places like Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Winnipeg, right into our own communities in Stratford and Clinton, it is folks that grow up in our schools, that go to our own jobs, that were born and raised, that access the same hospitals that you and I would access, that have this horrible situation happen to them. Last question. What is the provincial conviction rate for human trafficking offenses? So most of you actually guessed it right at 12%. So it is slightly higher than some of the other crimes that we see. Things like sexual violence is another one that it falls just under that 12% mark. The reason why I make note of this is not to make this a disheartening conversation for anyone, but to understand that a human trafficking conviction is very, very difficult to obtain in court. This happens because in order for this to happen, the legal definition of human trafficking that we have to operate on and ensure that everything is met for that definition to happen is the recruitment, the harboring, and the transportation of an individual where there's some level of control, direction, or influence, and someone else is benefiting from their exploitation. Now, for those of you that didn't just write this down very quickly or don't have an encyclopedia or a journal in front of you or a dictionary, all of those words are very complicated and hold a lot of different meaning that can be argued by very articulate lawyers on different sides. This is why the conviction rate for a human trafficking charge is laid, is so low. With that being said, this is not my opportunity to dump on my police partners. That's not what I'm trying to do here with this. But my understanding is to make sure that you folks understand that it's often not a human trafficking charge that leads to a conviction. It's something else that we're able to prove along the way that happened during the same course of events. So I might not be able to prove that that person was recruited, transported, and harbored, and that someone else is benefiting from their exploitation, as simple as can be in a courtroom. But I can prove somewhere along the way that there was illegal drugs present, that there was a weapon used at one point, that they might have been assaulted physically or sexually at one point. All of those individual charges are things that are far easier to prove along the way to take advantage to say, hey, I might not be able to get bad guy X on a human trafficking charge, but I can get him on 6 counts of assault, and I can get him on illegal drug possession, and I can get him on use of a weapon, and I can get him on a break and enter. And all of a sudden, police will lay these charges repeatedly to try and address that concern. So when it comes to this piece, especially when we're talking about this conviction rate, the reason why I bring this up in particular is Huron County is actually infamously good at prosecuting human trafficking cases. We actually have a far higher success rate than the provincial average. We do quite well, and we're up almost to 30% conviction rate, which is incredible, purely because it is very, very difficult for us to talk about some of the pieces to get someone from point A, where they bring forward a disclosure, all the way through to the finish line at court. This is something that I wish every single victim would be prepared to do, but I also totally appreciate that I don't want to go to court for a parking ticket, much less go through an entire situation where someone has kind of gone through these years of exploitation along the way. Now, this is going to be a really interesting point for me because Debbie had a question earlier around statistics around human trafficking right here in our region. I will speak specifically to our statistics through victim services in a non-identifying way. So again, I apologize for how vague these statistics will be, but it's important for the protection of the folks that we do support that we go through that. At one point last year, we were so busy with human trafficking cases in Huron and Perth counties that when I went into schools, I had conversations with classrooms of 30 people and would say that 1 in 10 young girls in Huron County would be impacted by human trafficking. That was the statistical average last year, purely based on how busy we were with that. With that being said, we have received a serious number of calls since January 1st, where we started our new recording period. And I myself have been, I'm going to say, lucky to be involved in a number of different cases, both interprovincially and right here at home, where someone starts in Huron and Perth counties, ends up in a different province, and then returns home, and vice versa. Again, they're coming from out of province to our area. But these numbers are astronomical to a point where they're actually dedicating individual officers out of multiple detachments. Detective Greer is our detective out of Huron County, but there's a number that are specializing in this area purely based on the number of calls for service. Now, I won't go into too many details about the OPP budget and how they spend their money and how they choose to address some of these concerns, but think about it as any other job. If you were to work in an office setting and you had to shred paper all day and you had so much paper to shred that you hired someone and told them their entire job is to shred paper all day. That is something that all of us can look at and say, there must be a lot of paper to shred. That is the same realities that we're facing with human trafficking. If they're specializing, they're bringing individuals in and sticking them in major crime units to specialize in that area, we are dealing with astronomical numbers of folks that are being targeted. Now, similarly, I want to make note along the way of the demographics that are being targeted. It is that younger female population with majority of cases. I'm going to say roughly 80 to 90% of them falling within that 14 to 30 age group. With that being said, I also make note in Huron and Perth counties that the youngest victim we've ever supported is less than 10 years old, and the oldest person we've ever supported in a human trafficking case is older than 70 years old. So it's very important for us to understand that there is no demographic particularly that's targeted. It is spread out massively, but because of some of the other mitigating factors, things like vulnerabilities around the family, mental health, substance use, whatever else, young people tend to be targeted more often than not. And as a result, tend to pop up in our demographics far more frequently. So that actually concludes the number of questions that I have from an interactive state. What I do want to do is I want to pop back over to our presentation here. And I just want to make sure that if folks do have questions along the way, that we take every opportunity to answer them. So I do have some folks that reacted to the 1 in 10 statistic. Absolutely, I totally appreciate that that's complicated as well when we're having that conversation. It is astronomically high purely based on the fact that the number of individuals impacted in a human trafficking situation is never 1. So when we're dealing with a human trafficking situation and someone is experiencing human trafficking, very frequently there's someone else that is secondarily impacted when the spider web starts to kind of expand. I have to think of it as a broken window. If you break a window and you throw a golf ball or a baseball through that window, there's one hole where the ball goes in, but as time goes on, things start to spread more. And that spider web effect tends to lead to impacts on other individuals as well, whether it be additional individuals that were lured, additional individuals that were part of that process along the way, and we'll address that piece as well.
Just have another question coming in here, Dawson, from Paula. Paula is wondering about if children are being taught or any protocols that you're aware of in terms of school-based interventions around an international sign to ask for help when you're in school or in a classroom, something that's available to them in their toolbox to seek help when not able to verbally ask for it.
So with that, we've seen a lot of development of these tools very recently, especially when it comes to things like domestic violence, things like that. Again, what we see is it tends to happen more so in adult settings. I'm not sure if anybody here has ever heard of ordering an angel shot at a restaurant or a bar. When they go and they order that drink, they order that beverage. What is it? It's an indication to the server, to the bartender in most settings, especially in Ontario, that person that they're with is someone that they shouldn't be with, that person is not helpful along the way. The school system is not necessarily, as far as I know, developed a similar tool yet. With that, what we tend to get is we tend to get secondary disclosures. So rather than someone identifying that they're in a situation where they need help, what we often see is a teacher, a parent, a friend, someone going, I'm more concerned about the person that I'm connected with. I'm more concerned about my friend. Yeah, I've also heard of angel haircuts. Absolutely. That is a huge one as well. Being able to vocalize that, again, or they'll order by a specific lady's name is another one. Angelica, Angela, anything along those lines where it's a similar verbiage is an indication to somebody that they're looking for help. With that being said, it's very important for us to understand that with human trafficking, more times than not, we're dealing with situations where individuals are not identifying states of victimization purely based on that number we talked about with the boyfriend, with the husband, with someone that's trafficking them that they identify in a romantic relationship with. What we're seeing instead is someone reaching out and saying, I'm concerned about my sister. I'm concerned about this girl in my class. A teacher calls and says, my favorite student has not shown up for 10 days. I'm not sure what's going on. These are all situations that we tend to try and intervene on in different ways. And again, for the sake of putting the mind at ease of the folks that are on this call, when we receive that call, when we receive that information, we do jump into action immediately, even if it might not look like it. So what that might start with is an initial touch point to try and assess some of those needs. It might be reaching out for consultation or to get a plan in place with law enforcement. But what we're doing is we take those secondary disclosures and we use that in a way to set up primary contact with that victim in a way that allows them to have an opportunity to indicate whether or not there's stressors or whether they are safe in that moment. Awesome, and I appreciate Catherine Boyd made note of this on this call here. I just lost it. I don't know where'd it go. But there is anonymous reporting tools available, and I believe both boards do have anonymous reporting tools, just different methodologies for it. AMDSB has one online that's incredibly useful, where anyone can report directly to school administrators. Similarly, again, I will make note of the different ways that we've received indications that somebody might be in harm's way. I have had anyone from Facebook messages and Instagram messages to text messages to calls to emails. I even had someone tweet at me one time. But again, my indication at this point to all of you that are on this call right now is that I would rather you raise the concern in whatever methodology works best for you to ensure that the concern is raised, rather than looking for the right way to do it. So with that, in the same breath, I jokingly say, again, please don't do this. The school administrators will never, ever allow me to present to you ever again. But if you need to go outside and build a campfire and start sending smoke signals to get somebody's attention, please do that. It's more important to me that we raise the concern, that we make note of it along the way, rather than looking for the best way to do it.
Brad here is also wondering about awareness in the schools, and Dawson, maybe you can speak today. You were at St. Anne's Catholic Secondary in Clinton giving a assembly presentation on human trafficking. Maybe do you want to share some of the response that you received?
Absolutely, yeah, I'm happy to. So again, I was lucky enough today to attend St. Anne's Catholic Secondary School. It was a phenomenal opportunity for myself. I really appreciate speaking to those students and having the opportunity to share this information. With that being said, to put the mind at ease of some of the folks on this call, we are not going into elementary schools and explaining to third graders the dangers of human trafficking and the sex trade. That's not what we're doing. We take a very calculated approach to this, working alongside all of our stakeholders in a collaborative effort to try and share this information, starting with oversharing information that might be pertinent, not necessarily to human trafficking right now, but the basis of it, things like healthy relationships and understanding consent, understanding cyber safety and how we can be safe online, and some of those components with younger age groups to prepare them for some of the more in-depth conversations that we have going forward with that. I also have the opportunity now, I just received approval to do it, so I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. And we've launched it with a number of different school boards previously, but we are excited to launch with the Huron Perth Catholic District School Board. Plans to work with their actual education curriculum next year to bring in an integrated and staggered approach to introduction to human trafficking awareness for each grade from 7 through to 12. Again, starting with some of those basic topics, working all the way through. This is something that's absolutely in the works, and it's something that I'm very, very happy to be bringing forward in support of this. We've had the opportunity to launch similar programs with the Avon Maitland board. Thames Valley District School Board is also launching something similar out of London. So again, we are actively working in the right direction with this, because there is a huge need for students to recognize some of these challenges. And again, I do want to take a moment right now to applaud all of the educators that we have on this call, because without this level of awareness, we aren't able to bring forward these concerns and start to try and address some of these concerns before they become problems that require my intervention on the backside or my friends that I work with out of the detachment here. At this point, I just want to open it up and make sure I totally appreciate that there's a number of folks on this call. If anybody does have questions, I'm happy to field them now. Likewise, I'm also happy to leave my contact information if folks are not wanting to have it answered in a formal space. More important to me at this point that there's answers than questions. So likewise, whatever methodology works best. But if anybody does have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, so I do have the grade 7 and 8 introduction at AMDSB is through the Reset curriculum, funded out of the Waterloo Region Women's Crisis Center. So it is phenomenal along the way. We are very, very proud of that program. We're happy to continue to provide it along the way. Are you aware of any awareness programs being directed to hospital or healthcare providers, hospital staff? Yes, absolutely. So part of what I do when I have these conversations, again, frontline work does make up the majority of my job. I do handle domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking calls in Huron County somewhere along the way, whether it's me directly or it's my name on the file. I will be involved, unfortunately, with all of these situations. Part of that is developing safety and de-escalation strategies for folks like law enforcement, healthcare providers, first responders in general, to ensure that they are seeing some of the signs and symptoms that they might see in their professional spaces, working to try and identify some of the red flags that we are seeing, again, at the professional level, as opposed to something that might pop up from one of your friends or a youth that you're supporting in your classroom. Again, I often say that if we carry around a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. So the more tools that we're able to provide, the more options we have for folks along the way, specific to their field, specific to what they might be seeing. These are all conversations that are happening somewhere in the peripheral, somewhere in the background, try and, again, raise awareness around this concern, and also to promote a level of collaboration and joint interpretation of these problems, because oftentimes if someone is coming to school, they are seeing the same red flags that they are seeing in the hospital setting, that they are displaying at home, that they're displaying in the community. So if all of us have the ability to cooperatively work to address these concerns, one of us has the ability to make a note of it somewhere along the way and hopefully lead to an opportunity for intervention that will then alleviate stress on the rest of the system as well. Is there any other questions at this point? I just want to make sure I give every opportunity.
It's wonderful. I mean, maybe while there are some other questions brewing, I just wanted to, take a chance to thank you very much for such an informative webinar. It was so helpful for me to understand the stages of trafficking, who's doing it and their methods, learning about the various platforms that traffickers are using to try to engage and target young people. Like such an important thing, knowing that our youth and young children, right, are engaging in many platforms on social media. So important to help, keep our children safe. The information about disclosure, that process and how complicated that can be, the nature of leaving a trafficking situation, some of the challenges related to charging individuals. I mean, it sounds very challenging. And one thing I certainly, took away in terms of an assessment piece for me as a clinician in the school is just that piece around, readiness, and are they ready to take the next steps, right? It really does help inform, the options or the, who we contact, right? Contacting police in a consultative way, contacting, victim services, and just really stepping away from that maybe more reactionary call to 911, right? So I just really, truly appreciate all the information, very helpful. And I don't know if others, I thought Brad's question too, that really drove some discussion around that was really important as well. So yeah, if there are any other questions, there is a resource that the mental health and wellness team has put together for educators to understand and respond to potential signs and symptoms of human trafficking. So that resource is going to be shared with our staff again tomorrow. And are there other resources that we can access in the community here, Dawson, that you want to highlight?
So I just want to make a final note and a final sales pitch that at any point, if anybody has questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or anybody on our team here in Victim Services Huron. We are very happy to speak about the issues or have these consultative conversations. Again, sometimes it's a matter of just confirming that you're on the right path along the way and reinforcing, having somebody else to say, absolutely, we're doing the right things here. In the same breath, our website is a great resource. We do have a number of different training opportunities with that. There's about 6 hours worth of content. So if anybody's looking to replace their Netflix tonight and wants to really do a deep dive into the human trafficking world, we do have that content available through our website. Likewise, any of the other comparable, the Canadian Centre for Human Trafficking has some wonderful information as well. All of these are just a Google away. With that being said, please don't be afraid to reach out. I'm always happy to provide more specific resources if there is anything. And I also do want to take a moment to express my appreciation and my thanks to the Catholic Board for putting this on tonight, for making this an opportunity to share this information with folks along the way. Also to the Avon Maitland Board for their ability to collaborate with this and the role that they've played along the way. And with that, I also would like to highlight that there is a number of other alternative learning opportunities coming up as well as part of a caregiver mini-series. Please, again, take every opportunity provided to engage with this information. These folks are doing incredible work to work alongside us. We're, again, collaboratively trying to solve the world's problems one day at a time. With that in mind, please take every opportunity. If you do have questions for myself or anyone else otherwise, happy to address them. And please, we do hope that we see you folks down the road if we can help in any capacity. So thank you again for having us, and thank you for the opportunity. And likewise, please make sure you register for the rest of those sessions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dawson. Okay. Thanks everyone again for coming. And yeah, like Dawson said, keep an eye out for other series and webinars to come.